Chapter 6. Rotten to the Core. O God, that men should put an enemy in their mouths to steal away their brains, that we should with joy, pleasance, revel and applause transform ourselves into beasts. Othello. William Shakespeare, 1603. The Bacchanal of St. Dionysius. The name Sydney derives from Saint Denis of Paris, the patron saint of headaches and hangovers. Denis was also known as Dionysius, a name inherited from the Greek god of wine, drunkenness and wild orgies. Alcoholic excess is built into the very name of Sydney. Philip had attempted to restrict access to spirituous liquors, but consumption had triumphed over moderation by the time last drinks were called on his rule. And the drink being drunk was rum. Rum was first distilled by African slaves working Jamaica's sugar plantations. It was then adopted by the pirates of the Caribbean, who used it to mix bumbo, a manly seafaring cocktail of rum, water and sugar with just a hint of nutmeg. The pirates' endorsement gave rum serious cachet within the boating fraternity, and, after Jamaica fell to the Royal Navy in 1655, British sailors demanded a daily rum ration, although they passed on the nutmeg. The Admiralty happily obliged, as the sailors had previously demanded French brandy, which the Admiralty disapproved of because A. it was expensive, and B. it was French. British sailors liked a drink, and then they liked another one. The Admiralty knew what to do with a drunken sailor, but was struggling to work out what to do with 60,000 of them. In 1740, it responded by diluting the daily rum ration with water, a mysterious liquid that the sailors viewed with great suspicion. The resulting mixture was known as grog. Grog was no substitute for straight rum, and sailors were prepared to take extreme measures to obtain a proper drink. In 1805, Admiral Nelson defeated the combined French and Spanish fleets at Trafalgar, his victory only slightly marred by being shot dead by a Frenchman and having his corpse preserved in a barrel of rum on the voyage back to England. When the barrel was opened to prepare Nelson for his state funeral, it was full of decomposing war hero and empty of rum. The sailors had drilled a hole in the barrel and enjoyed Nelson-flavoured cocktails all the way back to London, which is why rum is sometimes known as Nelson's blood, and Royal Navy sailors referred to drinking their daily rum ration as tapping the Admiral. New South Wales was run by sailors, so the colony's love affair with rum was inevitable. The colonists loved rum so much that they used the term to describe all liquor. Australians nurse an etymological hangover from the colony's rum-obsessed early days, with grog still used as a generic Australian term for any alcoholic drink. But Philip's policies and the lack of contact with the outside world kept the flow of the universal spirit to a trickle until the Royal Admiral docked at Sydney Cove in October 1792. The Royal Admiral was a British East India Company trader-cum-convict transport, captained by Essex Bond, a canny entrepreneur who successfully combined his interests in sailing, selling alcohol and criminal conduct. Disclaimer. All characters appearing in this work are historical. Any resemblance to Alan Bond, whether living or dead, is purely coincidental. Philip had granted Bond a licence to sell porter, a weak and sludgy brown beer. Disclaimer. Any resemblance to 4X Swan Lager, to any other beer or hop-based carbonated alcoholic beverage at any past, present or future time owned, marketed, drunk, spilled or forgotten by Alan Bond is also purely coincidental. But there was no great profit in beer, so Bond illegally used the licence to sell the Royal Admiral's contraband cargo of spirits. David Collins recounted, "Much intoxication was the consequence. Several of the settlers, breaking out from the restraint to which they had been subject, conducted themselves with the greatest impropriety, beating their wives, destroying their stock, trampling on and injuring their crops in the ground, and destroying each other's property." This bacchanal encouraged the business plans of a young lieutenant of the New South Wales Corps, a man whose pathological ambition and overweening sense of self-entitlement would transform Australian society over the next 2 decades. His name was John MacArthur. Bodice Jack. John MacArthur's father was an underwear salesman, an unusual career choice for a man whose countrymen proudly asserted that "a true Scotsman wears nothing under his kilt." The terms to go commando or to go regimental, meaning to dress without underpants, derive from the official undress code of Scottish military regiments. During the First World War, Scots officers on the Western Front would check that their troops were not wearing underwear under their kilts, aided by a mirror attached to the end of a golf club. The kilt was retired as a combat uniform in 1940, as Scottish soldiers had discovered during World War I that mustard gas, assisted by the wind funnel effect of a tartan manskirt, played havoc with a Scotsman's naked bagpipes. Some Scots soldiers seeking additional gas protection in the Great War charged into battle wearing ladies' stockings. These accessorised nicely with their skirts. The MacArthur clan therefore left Scotland for England, a land of opportunity where a man could wear a pair of boxer shorts with pride, and a lady who ventured out without at least 4 layers of hosiery, corsetry and assorted gussetry was no lady at all. Young John was ashamed of his family's humble origins. He desperately wanted to be a gentleman, but the only way a player in the small clothes game could hope to gain admittance to a gentleman's club was through the tradesman's entrance. So MacArthur opted out of the family business and set about scaling the social ladder with the ferocious intensity that he would later apply to destroying 5 governors of New South Wales. But no matter how fast or high he climbed, the underpants of his past climbed with him. His enemies, whom he collected in much the same way that Imelda Marcos collected shoes, relentlessly reminded him of his lowly birth, calling him a staymaker's apprentice and Bodice Jack. John MacArthur liked himself and expected others to do the same. He had a sensual face with high cheekbones and full lips, framed by artfully casual cascades of raven hair. Smallpox scars gave him a villainous air, but it was the villainy of a Heathcliff or a Darcy. The sort of villainy that impractical young women who spend far too much time reading are convinced masks a deep, untapped well of masculine sensitivity. They are also convinced that the well can only be tapped by an impractical young woman who spends far too much time reading. And it doesn't hurt to play the pianoforte, or to have a bunch of silly younger sisters who make you seem far more intelligent and interesting than you actually are. MacArthur's wife, Elizabeth, had married him because of his confidence, despite his poor financial and social standing, although the fact that she was 4 months pregnant may have also had something to do with it. Elizabeth was both attracted and mildly repelled by John's high opinion of himself, writing soon after their wedding that her husband was too proud and haughty for our humble fortune. MacArthur believed that a military career provided the best prospects for social advancement. However, getting shot dead on a foreign battlefield would prevent him from attending the right kind of parties, so he simply refused to fight. John spent 1788 AWOL from his Gibraltar regiment, writing outraged letters demanding that he receive full pay until such time as he might choose a posting more to his liking. Surprisingly, MacArthur eventually chose the newly established New South Wales Corps. New South Wales was not a sexy posting, and officers with money and connections avoided it like the plague. In India, a young lieutenant might immerse himself in gin and polo, occasionally stirring to shoot a few tigers or loot the palace of a Maharaja who had failed to grasp the finer points of British imperialism. New South Wales, in contrast, was sadly deficient in the Bombay sapphire, pony and mallet, big game hunting and uppity natives with palaces to loot departments. So few soldiers wanted to join the Corps that its commandant, Major Francis Grose, was forced to recruit deserters from London's Savoy military prison. The prison was later converted into London's famous Savoy Hotel. The inmates would have known something was up when the warden started leaving little chocolates at the end of their bunks. The Corps attracted officers of limited talent and boundless capacity for corruption, providing the perfect environment for the advancement of a man as keen as a razor and as rapacious as a shark, as one fellow officer admiringly described MacArthur. The 23-year-old MacArthur, Elizabeth and their infant son boarded the Neptune, the soon-to-be infamous Second Fleet death ship. MacArthur wasted no time in alienating his superiors by complaining that his cabin should be relocated so that he would not have to endure the foul smell and even fouler language of the Neptune's convict women. When Captain Gilbert refused this demand for an upgrade, MacArthur did what any gentleman would do. He challenged Gilbert to a duel. Although both men survived unscathed, the conflict led to Gilbert being replaced by the sadistic Donald Trail. But Trail also found MacArthur's carping about his cabin insufferable and accused him of using its passage to the deck to eavesdrop on private conversations. So Trail nailed the passage shut, forcing the MacArthurs to walk through a corridor crammed with sick convicts to reach the rest of the ship. After this, MacArthur sulked in his room, periodically emerging to criticise the food. This irritated his commanding officer further, who transferred the MacArthurs to another ship in the hope of a little peace and quiet. Peace and quiet did not sit comfortably with MacArthur, who exploded into the colony with all the tact of a small arms dealer advertising in Thalidomide Monthly. When he fronted Philip to explain why the Corps had breached regulations by importing spirits, his patronising tone so incensed the normally placid governor that Philip threatened to lock him up. MacArthur replied, "Sir, you may please yourself. You are the first officer that ever threatened me with arrest, and I give you my word of honour if I am put in arrest, I shall require a full and sufficient explanation of the cause before I consent to sit quietly down under such a disgrace." Philip, stunned by MacArthur's hauteur, backed down and invited him to dinner. MacArthur refused. He had learned a valuable lesson that he would apply in his dealings with future governors. Treat them mean and keep them keen. Interlude with the bastard. On the day that John MacArthur joined the Corps, William Bligh was sitting in a tiny open boat in the middle of the Timor Sea. It was raining and he didn't have a change of clothes. His lips were sun and salt cracked and he had a gripping pain in the empty place that had once been his stomach. The exhausted mariner would have traded all his worldly goods, half a coconut and a dead seagull, for an hour of blissful sleep in MacArthur's cabin aboard the Neptune. But the trade would need to be made quickly, because he really didn't like the way the other 18 guys in the boat were looking at his seagull. How had it come to this? William Bligh and John MacArthur had much in common. Both grew up in Plymouth. Both had solid middle-class backgrounds. Bligh's father was one of the hated customs officers who interfered with an Englishman's inalienable right to smuggle tea. And both were complete bastards. Bligh had learned how to be a bastard at sea. He'd entered service as a ship's boy at the age of 7 and 15 years later was appointed Master of the Resolution for Cook's third voyage. Although Bligh successfully steered the boat home after Cook found himself on the wrong end of the rotisserie, his odious personality meant that he was the only officer not promoted upon the Resolution's return. Bligh was a short man with an overly large head, weak chin, rapidly receding hairline and gorilla-like body. He would have been the perfect casting choice for one of the more disagreeable Oompa Loompas. Like many short men, he compensated for his stumptitude by being aggressive and overbearing. Short man syndrome was originally known as the Napoleon complex. This is unfair, as Napoleon was 5'6", which was 3 inches taller than most of his compatriots. Napoleon was actually compensating for being French. Bligh also had a fouler mouth than a Tourette sufferer at the business end of a bucks night, with his swearing legendary even within bawdy naval circles. But Bligh had connections. He had married the niece of Duncan Campbell, the Hulk guy, and acted as Campbell's agent in Jamaica. His service under Cook had also brought him to the attention of Sir Joseph Banks. Banks was an enthusiastic advocate of slavery and desperately wanted to increase the economic efficiency of the African layabouts in the British Caribbean. Unfortunately, the Negro would not cut cane unless he was fed, which cost plantation owners money. While money didn't grow on trees, breadfruit did, so Banks decided to slash slave food bills by transplanting this high-yielding crop from Tahiti to the Caribbean. Banks recommended Bligh for the job, given his familiarity with Tahiti and Jamaica and his reputation as an excellent navigator and strict disciplinarian. Discipline would be critical, as Bligh's crew would be doing it tough. Banks had insisted that most of their cabin space be converted for the exclusive use of the breadfruit plant, and that no dogs, cats, monkeys, parrots, goats, or indeed any animals whatever must be allowed on board. Every precaution must be taken to prevent or destroy the rats as often as is convenient. A boat with green boughs should be laid alongside, with a gangway of green boughs laid from the hold to her, and a drum kept going below in the vessel for 1 or more nights. And as poison will constantly be used to destroy them and cockroaches, the crew must not complain if some of them who may die in the ceiling make an unpleasant smell. The sailors had to contend not only with sleepless nights lying on top of each other in a toxic fog as the heavy reverberation of the night drum rained showers of dead cockroaches and twitching rats down upon their hammocks, but also with Bligh's regular explosions of rage. 16 men deserted before the HMS Bounty set sail, and the remaining sailors began to refer to their captain as the Bounty Bastard, a nickname that would stick with him for the rest of his life. Things worsened at sea. Although the refitted Bounty was too cramped to accommodate a full crew, Bligh had found enough room for Michael Byrne, a blind Irish fiddle player. Bligh forced the overworked sailors to dance to Byrne's irritating Irish jigs for 3 hours each evening in the belief it was conducive to their health. The crew sought to avoid this humiliation by obtaining 6 certificates from Thomas Huggins, the Bounty's alcoholic surgeon. Huggins, who hated Bligh for ordering him to stop drinking, diagnosed each complaint as scurvy. This enraged Bligh, who maintained that he ran the healthiest ship in the Navy. Bligh also alienated John Fryer, the Bounty's experienced master, by promoting the young Fletcher Christian over him. Christian was an impoverished gentleman whose mother had frittered away the family's fortune on miniature portraits and bonnets. He was tall, dark and handsome with a rough edge, as evidenced by the stars tattooed on his left breast and buttocks. Less appealingly, he was bow-legged and subject to violent perspirations, and particularly in his hands, so that he soils anything he handles. This description was published in the wanted notice circulated by Bligh after the Bounty mutiny. Officers searching for the mutineers, bounty hunters, would approach any man fitting Christian's description, shake his hand, and then demand that he drop his trousers and display his backside. Searching for Christian remained a surprisingly popular naval pastime over the next 2 decades. Bligh had taken Christian on 2 of his previous voyages and treated him as a favoured son, regularly inviting him to private dinners and giving him access to his liquor cabinet. But Bligh's perfectionist streak meant he was disappointed when Christian failed to live up to expectations, which was often. When Bligh was disappointed, he shouted, stamped and swore, and Christian bore the brunt of it. The crew of the Bounty spent 23 weeks in Tahiti waiting for favourable winds and for the breadfruit saplings to take to their pots. Everybody had a great time, except for Huggins, who drank himself to death. But the good times stopped rolling as soon as the Bounty set sail for home. There are various theories as to the causes of the Bounty mutiny. Bligh believed his crew rebelled because he insisted that the ship be loaded with breadfruit rather than semi-naked Polynesian women. Madge Darby, author of the racy Captain Bligh in Wapping, insists that Christian was driven over the edge by his unrequited love for Bligh. Richard Howe, author of Captain Bligh and Mr. Christian, argues that Christian's love was requited by Bligh on a regular basis, and that the mutiny was sweet man love turned sour. The most striking theory is advanced by Karl Lawback, author of The Great Bounty Conspiracy, Bligh and His Breadfruit, who contends that Bligh had a passionate affair with a tall bisexual Tahitian chief named Tina and secretly masterminded the mutiny against himself so that he would not have to tell Banks that all his breadfruit trees had died. Most historians, however, accept the Nutgate theory, which goes like this. Bligh woke on the morning of 27 April 1789. The sun was shining, the seagulls were singing, and he had a lovely bunch of coconuts. Or so he thought. The English are fascinated by coconuts because of their limitless potential for double entendre, the staple of English comedy ever since Oscar Wilde decamped from Ireland in 1874. The coconut craze reached its zenith with Fred Heatherton's 1944 harmlessly risque classic, I've Got a Lovely Bunch of Coconuts. The Swedes, whose tastes are much darker, see anything by Ingmar Bergman, released their own adaptation of the song in 1950. Fa ya kan inte fa upp min kokosnot, Dad, I can't crack my coconut open, is the story of a Swedish boy who, in attempting to open an obdurate coconut, disfigures his mother, destroys all her furniture, and finally blows up the family home. When Bligh conducted his regular morning nut inspection, he was a nut or two short. Bligh, with all the fury of a squirrel burgled on the last day of autumn, shouted for the crew to bring their nuts on deck to be counted. When this failed to produce the missing nuts, Bligh demanded that Christian disclose where his nuts were hidden. Christian replied, "I do not know, sir, but I hope you don't think me so mean as to be guilty of stealing yours." Bligh exploded, "Yes, you damned hound, I do! You must have stolen them from me, or you could have given me a better account of them. God damn you, you scoundrels! You are all thieves alike and combine with the men to rob me. I suppose you'll steal my yams next." Something in Christian broke that day. That night, he rounded up the most dissatisfied members of the crew, seized the ship's weapons, and led his men against Bligh. Bligh and 18 loyalists were lowered into a 23-foot launch and set adrift with meagre supplies of water, rum, wine, biscuit bread, breadfruit and coconut. The launch was too crowded for anyone to lie down and so low in the water that constant bailing was required to keep it afloat. When Bligh pulled in for supplies at the nearby Friendly Islands, the unfriendly islanders attacked his men, stoning John Norton to death. Bligh callously recorded that Norton's death was a fortunate circumstance, for he was the stoutest man in the ship, which circumstances would very materially have interfered with the boat's progress and the allowance of provisions. But the death of the Bounty's resident fatty did not solve Bligh's food problems. Bligh gave Robert Lamb, the young ship's butcher, a good beating for eating 9 raw seabirds he had captured, rather than sharing them, and had a violent argument with Fryer over the proper recipe for oyster stew. Bligh challenged another of his men to a duel in a separate oyster-related argument. Bligh did not deteriorate as quickly as most of his men, who accused him of deliberately sprinkling breadcrumbs into the bottom of the launch when doling out the day's minuscule ration and eating the sodden crumbs when no one was looking. 41 days after the mutiny, Bligh arrived in Dutch Timor, having completed an incredible 6,710-kilometre journey across the Pacific and up the North Queensland coast, the longest open boat voyage ever completed. Despite this amazing feat, most of the Bligh loyalists were no longer on speaking terms with their captain and sailed home in separate boats. Some of the mutineers settled in Tahiti, where they fought among themselves and shot lots of Tahitians in a particularly vicious civil war. The survivors were eventually taken back to England and court-martialled. Christian and 8 of his most hardcore followers kidnapped 9 Tahitian women to serve as sex slaves and 18 Tahitian men and boys to just do the slave bit. He massacred over 60 Tubai Islanders and left a trail of dysentery and venereal disease across the Pacific, giving proof to the adage that you can never trust a man with sweaty palms. Christian's party finally settled on the remote and uninhabited Pitcairn Island, where sexual imbalance and the poor treatment of the Tahitians rapidly led to the Pitcairners shooting each other, chopping each other up with axes, and pushing each other off cliffs. By the time the outside world found Pitcairn in 1808, only one of the mutineers, John Adams, survived. A few dozen descendants of the Bounty mutineers still inhabit Pitcairn, which remains the world's smallest and most inbred colony. The Bounty story captured the imagination of the British public. Bligh was first hailed as a hero, but his integrity was soon called into question. He was believed to have attempted to defraud the Admiralty by submitting bogus receipts for goods purchased in Timor. He also lodged a whopping £283 insurance claim for the loss of his personal possessions after the mutiny, including £59 for port, wine and brandy, and 18 shillings for a dozen nightcaps of the non-alcoholic variety. The claim was rejected. As reports of Bligh's abusive behaviour emerged from members of his former crew, sympathy switched to Christian. Although Christian had been shot dead by a disgruntled Tahitian in 1793, he became the Elvis of his era, and it was rumoured that he had secretly returned to England. Sightings of the glamorous mutineer were reported for decades. Christian's mythical return is thought to have inspired Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. No one ever wrote a famous poem about Bligh. So what if Bligh wasn't loved? He had his health, he was universally admired as a navigator, and he still held the world record for the number of four-letter words used in a single sentence. And he'd put all that mutiny business behind him, hadn't he? Dark Junta Rising. Back in New South Wales, Phillip's departure had left a vacuum, and with no replacement governor on the horizon, the New South Wales Corps rushed to fill it. Major Francis Grose, who assumed the lieutenant governorship of the colony, immediately demonstrated that he would be a very different ruler from Phillip. Grose was lazy and corpulent, with stunned fish eyes and a prodigious double chin that suggested somewhere in heaven a cherub was desperately searching for its missing buttocks. He was outraged that he continued to receive convict rations and encouraged his officers to band together to import additional tasty treats for themselves. But money was in short supply, with Spanish dollars, Irish banknotes and assorted copper coins dribbling into the colony and draining out of it even quicker. However, officers of the Corps were issued with bills of exchange to cover their pay, and those bills could be redeemed for sterling in Britain. The officers bought the cargoes of ships docking in Sydney and on-sold them with markups that would make a used car dealer blush. Sydney was only just emerging from starvation, and the officers were pleased to discover that the colonists would hand over everything they owned for a bag of rice. Colonists who attempted to deal directly with traders were the victims of unfortunate accidents, like falling down their bedroom stairs in the middle of the night. Accidents of this kind were regarded as particularly unfortunate because everyone lived in single-storey houses. Traders who tried to bypass the Corps were stopped from unloading their ships and had future cargoes boycotted. The Corps was determined that the colony's magistrates should not stop its game of monopoly, so Grose fired them all and stacked the bench with hand-picked military officers. The officers used the stacked bench to their advantage, bringing fraudulent prosecutions against those who interfered with their business dealings. The officers accepted payments from convicts to amend their criminal records and provided a boutique revenge service, enabling jilted lovers and other malcontents to buy longer sentences for their enemies. MacArthur was the calm eye of the Corps storm, untouchable at its centre. He was an early investor in the Corps' racketeering, but made his real money by privatising New South Wales. More than any other man, he was responsible for dismantling Phillip's socialist bureaucracy and loosing the running dogs of capital upon the colony. Grose was interested in comfort, not power. Time spent pulling the levers of government was time spent away from the French cheese and racy little Spanish sherry that MacArthur had just imported for him. Declaring, "I am unequal to manage by myself," he appointed MacArthur as Inspector of Public Works for the thriving new settlement of Parramatta. MacArthur believed that public works didn't. Phillip's government farms only produced food, but in private hands they could grow rich crops of money. The British government had recently agreed that officers could be granted land without resigning their commissions, an unusual arrangement considered necessary to attract soldiers to serve at the arse end of the world. MacArthur, who was responsible for allocating land on the fertile Cumberland Plain, granted the most barren and rocky parcels to freed convicts and the few recently arrived free settlers, reserving the most attractive holdings for his cronies. He took 100 acres of the best land at Parramatta, named it Elizabeth Farm after his wife, and rapidly expanded his property portfolio by recommending further grants to himself. Elizabeth Farm is Australia's oldest surviving homestead. Here Elizabeth lived in isolation, complaining of having no female friend to unbend my mind to. The only woman from her social stratum was Mrs. Reverend Johnson, a tedious godbotherer from whom she derived neither pleasure nor profit. Elizabeth, who had lived a life of comfort as the daughter of a respectable landowner, found herself stranded on the other side of the globe with a bunch of prostitutes who couldn't play the piano, stitch needlepoint portraits of charming woodland animals, or engage in polite drawing-room conversation about nothing. While Grose advised Britain that the new soldier farmers were clearing their fields at their own expense, he had in fact granted each of them 10 convict labourers, all fed and clothed by the British taxpayer. Subsequent orders from London that officers be granted no more than 2 convicts each were studiously ignored. MacArthur was responsible for allocating convict workers in his fiefdom. He and his allies creamed the top off the labour market, while those who displeased him received farmhands riddled with tuberculosis, equipped with fewer than the usual number of limbs, or unnaturally interested in the colony's limited supply of livestock. A steady trickle of animal husbandry cases came before the courts in the early days of settlement. Successful prosecutions were difficult because of the requirement that 2 witnesses give evidence against the accused. Offenders not only had to be deviants, but exhibitionists to boot. James Rees was executed in 1799 for making bacon, as was the unfortunate sow he'd befriended. The colonial courts would also order the death of any 4-legged party to such proceedings in accordance with Leviticus 20:15. And if a man lie with a beast, he shall surely be put to death, and ye shall slay the beast. MacArthur, meanwhile, deliberately ran down the public farms. Public convicts received smaller rations and were forced to labour for private landowners in their spare time to survive. When the public housing for convicts blew down in a storm, it was not rebuilt. Most audaciously, MacArthur ordered that the government store was not to accept free grain from the public farms until it had purchased all of the officers' crops. The officers had been granted free land, their labour costs were met by the British taxpayer, and then, in a breathtaking display of double-dipping, the taxpayer was slugged again to purchase their produce. Australian farmers have sought to socialise costs and privatise benefits ever since. Fucking Egypts. Although they had their pick of the convicts, MacArthur and his henchmen couldn't find enough experienced farmhands to tend their ever-expanding estates. Most of the English convicts were city dwellers, whose only experience with a hoe was with a lady who pretended to be really good at sewing. What the farmers really needed was some poor oppressed country folk. Cue the Irish. The Irish had been practising being oppressed by English landowners for centuries. Most of them were papists, which was English bigot speak for Catholics. The English had themselves been Catholics until 1534, but decided that the Roman Church had lost its moral legitimacy when it refused King Henry VIII permission to trade in his ugly old Spanish wife for his smoking hot mistress. The English took their anti-Catholicism seriously. Catholics kept sneaking back onto the throne, so they passed laws that the monarch could not profess the popish religion or marry a papist. This did not stop King George IV, a trenchant critic of Catholic emancipation, from secretly marrying his long-term Catholic mistress, Maria Fitzherbert. The provisions of the 1701 Act of Settlement that prevent the British monarch from marrying a Catholic were still in effect in 2013. Back in Ireland, Catholics were barred from holding public office and fined for not attending Anglican services. Irish Catholics could not own firearms or horses worth more than £5 and were forbidden from taking custody of orphans to protect vulnerable youth from the taint of papism. When a Protestant landowner died, his land passed to his eldest son. When a Catholic died, the Popery Act required his land to be split among his sons, breaking up the great Catholic estates. The law also required that Catholic churches be made from wood, so that they could be burned down more easily when the local Catholics misbehaved. Ireland in the late 18th century was still a feudal society. Most of the large landowners were Protestant and most of the serfs were Catholic. The English loved to make jokes about the Irish peasantry being a bit dim, and there was some truth in this stereotype. Catholic priests had been banned from educating little tykes, and malnutrition resulted in high levels of mental retardation. By 1780, 90% of the Irish were dependent on potatoes for sustenance. The 1815 Statistical Survey of Ireland found that Kilkenny labourers live entirely on potatoes and sour milk. The poor of County Clare didn't even get sour milk for 3 months of the year, making do with potatoes and salt. This diet meant that the Irish poor suffered from scurvy and scrofulous disorders, spoke slowly, and had difficulty tying their own shoelaces. The Irish were not initially transported to New South Wales. Instead, they were sent to Canada, which was the bit of America the Americans didn't want. Irish convicts had an even worse time of it than their English counterparts. In 1788, the Providence carried 126 of them to Canada. The 80 who survived the 4-week voyage were thrown into the rocky surf at gunpoint. 1 perished when dashed against the rocks, 6 died of exposure, and the rest were taken to the Nova Scotian village of Sydney. The British loved naming their miserable lice-infested convict settlements after Lord Sydney. Lord Sydney would have preferred sponsoring a town with a cathedral, or at least a nice fountain. Sir Henry Brown Hayes, the Sheriff of Cork, sent the first Irish convicts to Sydney, not the Canadian one, aboard the Queen in 1791. Most of these convicts had committed the standard crimes: stealing handkerchiefs, wandering about with blackened faces, interfering with fish ponds. But some had committed offences that were uniquely Irish. For example, the innumerate or unipedal Mary McLoghlin was transported for felony of sock. Some Irish convicts were never tried or sentenced, but transported simply for the crime of Irishness. Irish women, unlike their English sisters, could be transported for the crime of homelessness. Irish gentlemen of limited means, meanwhile, all too frequently carried away maidens that be inheritors. Abducting heiresses was a peculiarly Irish offence that involved bursting into a ballroom wearing a mask, throwing the nearest heiress onto a horse valued at less than £5, galloping off to meet an unscrupulous priest who would perform a marriage for half a pint of Guinness, deflowering said heiress in a barn, taking her back to her home, and demanding that her guardian hand over her inheritance. The guardian would generally comply, as the Catholic Church judged divorce to be a far greater sin than raping a young woman in a barn. Abducting heiresses was so popular that groups of like-minded Irish youths formed abduction clubs. Club members paid household servants to report on the fortunes and movements of potential wives, and drew lots to determine which lucky bachelor would get the girl. The club would then help the winner to kidnap his prize. Sir Henry Brown Hayes, having dispatched the first Irish convicts to Australia, joined them after abducting Mary Pike, who had been left £20,000 by her doting grandfather. He had made the mistake of abducting a Quaker. Quakers took a far more pragmatic approach to divorce than Catholics and generally frowned upon the whole barn business. Hayes was transported for life, but his status allowed him to purchase a comfortable cabin aboard the Atlas, while 64 of his countrymen died below. Peers of the realm were not expected to do convicty things, so Hayes was permitted to build himself the luxurious Vaucluse house, which he surrounded with 500 tons of imported Irish turf in the belief that grass from the land trodden by St Patrick would ward off the colony's snakes. Hayes was also noted for playing host to the colony's largest moustache in an era when facial hair was unfashionable, having sworn an oath not to cut the hair on his upper lip until he was free to return to Ireland. Moustache growing was a uniquely Irish form of political protest. The English colonists were greatly amused by the superstitious paddies who now walked among them, wearing funny hats, smoking little clay pipes, and saying incomprehensible things like "begorra." The Book of Leinster, a 12th century manuscript of Gaelic literature and mythology, perfectly sums up the superstitious nature and general credulity of the Irish. The scribe who copied it warned his Irish readers, "Do not credit the details of the story or fantasy. Some things in it are devilish lies, and some poetical figments. Some seem possible, and others not. Some are for the enjoyment of idiots." The Irish convicts who disembarked in New South Wales from the Queen in 1792 reinforced the view that the Irish had spent too long paddling in the shallow end of the gene pool. The Irish were enthusiastic, if not terribly successful, escape artists. In 1792, 21 of the Queen convicts escaped Sydney. Equipped with a paper compass one of them had drawn, and started walking to China, which they believed lay about 150 miles to the north. Whenever the escapees ran into an obstacle, the one holding the paper would simply rotate it, so that the arrow pointed away from the cliff face, ocean, or band of angry Aborigines that blocked his path. Then he and his fellow escapees would dutifully follow the arrow until something else got in their way. Watkin Tench described how these Chinese travellers were later discovered naked, starving, and eating poisonous berries. One had died of fatigue, another of spear, and 4 had been seriously roughed up by the Eora. they had managed to escape an impressive 26 miles. In 1798, David Collins recounted the tale of another group of Irish prisoners who'd decided to run away to a secret white empire that they believed lay about 300 miles southwest of Sydney, in which they were assured of finding all the comforts of life without the necessity of labouring for them. The governor got wind of their plan, and given the various ingenious ways in which previous Irish escapees had managed to die, was concerned for their welfare. And so began the only state-sponsored prison breakout in Australian history. The governor provided the escapees with provisions and an armed escort and told them to be careful. He also appointed John Wilson to guide them to the purported location of the lost civilization so that they could see that there was nothing there. Wilson was a First Fleet cloth thief who later renounced all cloth goods, preferring instead to wander about in a kangaroo skin loincloth. He moved in with an Aboriginal tribe, was marked with the ritual scars of initiation, attempted to abduct young Aboriginal and European girls, and took up the name Bunboe. Bunboe had explored all the countryside within 100 miles of the colony and crossed the Blue Mountains more than 15 years before Blaxland, Wentworth and Lawson. Blaxland, Wentworth and Lawson continue to be credited as the first Europeans to cross the Blue Mountains because they fit the noble explorer stereotype. They were wealthy, had nice haircuts and wore cravats. Australians do not like to think that their continent was unlocked by a wild-eyed, dreadlocked, marsupial-clad pedophile. The escapees accompanying Wilson soon got tired and asked to go home. The expedition's lasting legacy was the discovery of the koala, an animal whose mindless imbecility rivalled that of the Irish. The koala was originally known as the colourwine. It was then called sloth, monkey and monkey bear before its current name stuck. None of this worried the koala, which was too whacked on gum leaves to care what people called it. David Collins, who was contemptuous of the Irish in the way that only an Anglo-Irishman could be, wrote in recounting the heroic failures of numerous Irish escapees, "Could it be imagined that at this day there was existing in a polished civilised kingdom a race of beings, for they do not deserve the appellation of men, so extremely ignorant and so little humanised as these were, compared with whom the naked savages of the mountain were an enlightened people?" Although the English colonists liked to look down on their cousins from across the Western Sea, the Irish were initially welcome to New South Wales. They liked to drink and a fight and were kind of fun. They also knew how to work on a farm without getting paid. The Irish were vital to the New South Wales economy, particularly as the transportation of English convicts was declining. Back in Europe, a young officer named Napoleon had radically departed from French military tradition. He ignored the time-honoured tactics of le surrender and le run away and was actually winning battles. England was once again at war with France and needed all of its undesirables to stand in front of Napoleon's cannons. The Irish were not trusted for this important job because they kept asking the French to help them drive the British out of Ireland. So Irish transportation increased as English transportation slowed. More than 165,000 convicts arrived in Australia between 1788 and 1868. About a quarter of them, and half of all convict women, were Irish. Australia's Irish population exploded with the introduction of assisted immigration and the influx of tens of thousands of people who liked to get drunk at parties but who were ideologically opposed to contraception. The rate of Irish immigration and childbirth in Australia's early days means there's a little bit of Egypt in most of us. The liquid economy. Adam Smith's 1776 blockbuster, The Wealth of Nations, urged against government interference in the economy. Smith argued that the most successful societies allow self-interest to flourish, with the riches accrued by the enterprising and ambitious trickling down into the pockets of the grateful everyman. He also wrote, "The colony of a civilised nation which takes possession either of a waste country or of one so thinly inhabited that the natives easily give place to the new settlers, advances more rapidly to wealth and greatness than any other human society." Smith was strangely silent on what the natives get out of such an arrangement. Presumably, they get a warm inner glow from knowing that they have done their bit to make the enterprising and ambitious foreigners who have built a wheat farm on their traditional hunting grounds more successful. Smith's "greed is good" mantra was music to MacArthur's ears. Smith had not only earmarked him for wealth and greatness, but had made it clear that his being an exploitative bastard was, in fact, a public service. Liquid assets are more capable of trickling down than illiquid ones, so rum became the currency of choice, with the pound making way for the pint and the shilling swapped for the shot. While Navy sailors and Essex Bond had sly grog spirits into the colony from its earliest days, the rum ball really started rolling in 1793, when Gross purchased the cargo of the Hope, an American sealer that reportedly would not sell its food supplies unless Gross also bought its spirits. Gross made all the right kind of protesting noises for the benefit of his political masters in London, who still envisaged New South Wales as a dry colony. He then sold the barrels of rum to the colony's officers, who traded it by the bottle to thirsty convicts and free settlers with markups of up to 1,200%. By the end of the year, the Corps was importing stills to brew money and ruthlessly cracking down on any settler found forging moonshine. The soldiers who ruled New South Wales had earned their infamous Rum Corps moniker. The colony's lack of money meant that barter was the norm, with farmers paying their workers in sugar, tobacco and, to the joy of their convict labourers, handkerchiefs. But not even the handkerchief could compete with rum. David Collins, who despite his taste for a bit of convict strange was cementing himself as the colony's moralist, glumly reported that the convicts preferred receiving liquor for labour to every other article of provisions or clothing that could be offered them. The convicts gratefully received their wages by the bottle or jug and would bundy on as soon as they'd bundied off. Collins was convinced that liquor led to other vices, particularly gambling. He wrote, "To such excess was this pursuit carried among the convicts that some had been known, after losing provisions, money and all their spare clothing, to have staked and lost the very clothes on their wretched backs, standing in the midst of their associates as naked and as indifferent about it as the unconscious natives of the country." Alexandro Malaspina, a Spaniard who visited Sydney in 1793, was amazed by all the new drunks who wanted to play cards with him. He wrote of the colonists' continued abuse of liquor and frequent, at times, baseless duels, but believed the colony's moral laxity was most apparent in its women, who approach announcing the price at which they sell their favours. The excess of alcohol had a profound impact on New South Wales. One Christmas Eve, two settlers competed in a drinking competition using raw spirits, and one did not wake up to find out whether Santa thought he'd been naughty or nice. Thomas Daveney, a convict judged by Philip to be a most useful man and promoted to overseer of the Toongabbie public farm, met his end in half a gallon of Cape brandy. Rumours circulated that the officers were buying the land of desperate drunks for a bottle of rum a plot. Yet Smith's trickle-down theory proved accurate in New South Wales. The colony was becoming prosperous in appearance, with stately homes springing up between groves of Banksia and Grevillea. As agriculture expanded, the threat of famine receded. Women who had been unable to fall pregnant after years of grinding poverty suddenly became fertile, and Australia underwent its first baby boom. In 1801, the visiting French naturalist Francois Perron noted that, after residing a year or two at Port Jackson, most of the English prostitutes became remarkably fruitful. Rather than attributing this to changes in climate and diet, he believed the fertility of the disgusting prostitutes was linked to the sudden revolution in their moral conduct, paradoxically arguing that a reduction in sexual activity resulted in more babies, as an excess of sexual intercourse destroys the sensibility of the female organs. Things were also looking up for the convicts. They became part of the private economy, receiving payment for work performed outside regular convicting hours. The officers' social snobbery and general laziness prevented them from retailing, so they wholesaled to their convict mistresses or servants, who opened shops and taverns. Convict agents like Simeon Lord soon owned grander houses than the governor. In 1794, James Roos left the land granted to him by Philip and led 22 mostly ex-convict farmers to settle the Hawkesbury. Collins wrote disapprovingly that the Hawkesbury settlers consumed their time and substance in drinking and rioting, untrusting to the extreme fertility of the soil, which they declared would produce an ample crop at any time without much labour. The authorities back in Britain began to get edgy about all the healthy convicts drinking rum in the sun, while the homegrown poor continued to scrabble for scraps in the smog and muck. The English clergyman Sidney Smith wrote, "The ancient avocation of picking pockets will certainly not become more discredited from the knowledge that it may eventually lead to the possession of a farm of 1,000 acres on the River Hawkesbury." Smith was a towering intellect and moral philosopher and the greatest satirist since Jonathan Swift. Yet today he is best known for his rhyming recipe for potato salad, popularised in Common Sense in the Household, a manual of practical housewifery. Although the colony had developed rapidly following Philip's departure, the Corps' days of rum and roses were drawing to a close. Mother Britain had wearied of military rule in her father's flung outpost and was preparing to send a plague of governors to blight the house of MacArthur.